About the impact and history of budget deficit and uh, government debt. And I'm gonna mainly talk about the cases in the US. Okay, so look at this graph. Very interesting. Right? We have government outlays up here, and we have tax revenue. Government outlay, which is what government is spending and paying, is exceeding what they're collecting as tax. That is budget deficit. And when deficit happens, government debt rises, right? Because debt is total amount that government needs to eventually pay back to those who have lent it, who they have borrowed from. Okay, let's start with keywords. Okay, we have budget deficit. It's an excess of total government outlays over total government tax revenue. In other words, it's government outlay minus tax revenue. If it's positive, that means there is deficit. They're spending and paying more than what they're gaining. How is that possible, right? I think a lot of people wonder how is it possible that they can pay and spend more than what they're collecting as tax. It is possible because they borrow some money from people who don't use those money, right? We have savers in the economy, people who don't spend all their income, and that money can be used to fund that deficit. That is deficit spending. And government bond is the tool for that. Okay, it's an interest-bearing security constituting a promise to pay at a specified future time. So the government issues government bond. It's called treasury bond in the U.S. Treasury securities in the U.S. And people pay it for it. People buy it, so the U.S. government can get some money to fund the government projects that they want to do. But instead, eventually they have to pay back because bondholders have a right to get back the principal plus the interest. So that interest is what incentivizes those people to uh, lend money so the government can borrow it and fund their projects. And government debt, very important ideas. The total amount owed by the government to all claimants, including foreigners, the public, and other government accounts. So if we have budget deficit, government debt rises. If we have budget surplus, which is opposite of deficit, the government debt declines. We also have debt held by public, the gross federal debt minus the debt owned to other government accounts, right? So when it comes to Social Security and Medicare accounts, they collect, they work, like how they work is that they collect payroll tax and they pay to those people who gonna get money of Social Security and Medicare, mainly old people, right? In this process, sometimes there is surplus. They're collecting more payroll tax than what they pay as Social Security and Medicare payment. That surplus is gonna be translate to government bond because those people who deal with those accounts want to make sure uh, they can buy safe uh, government bond that's gonna pay some interest. However, it's at the end of the day this is government accounts, so we do not. Sometimes it's better if we exclude this from the calculation of total debts that government needs to deal with because eventually ultimately the government is kind of like borrowing money from another wallet, right? It's still separate. Those social security, Medicare are not or off budget, but it's basically like different wallets. They are you know transferring money from one to another, but the owner is same, which is the government. So we kind of like the government debt held by the public is sometimes better indication of how much the government actually needs to pay back to outside agents that is not the government. We have internal debt and external debt. The portion of gross federal debt that is owed to individuals or groups within the country. We also have external debt, which is the portion of gross federal debt that is owed to foreign individuals or groups. So let's start with this question of how is this possible that government just borrows money to fund their projects, right? It is possible because we have a lot of savers in our economy. Saver, Savers produce more goods and services than what they consume. Imagine like let's say doctors who work at the hospital. They provide a service of healthcare to people, patients. They get income. Are they going to spend all the income? Maybe they could. Maybe they could spend. However, a lot of them don't. Some of them will. Well, he will definitely, let's say, like buy food that he needs, and he wants to eat, and he can go some shopping. He can buy some bags that he wants to buy. He can pay for. He will probably pay for gasoline to drive. He will pay rent to live in a house, but he's not going to spend all of them. And what this means is that he's providing more services to the economy than what he's actually consuming, right? He's using less than what he actually deserves in terms of what he has provided to the economy, and that is saving. He's gonna have some money left. He can put that into bank account so farms can use it, or he can buy treasury security so the government can use it. This is how saving works. Uh, Therefore, the government can borrow from savers and purchase goods and services, and the government can use this money to fund education, military, and infrastructure. All of this is possible because he didn't use up all the goods and services that he actually deserved to consume. Yes, so in other words, if everyone in the economy consumes all goods and services that they produce, the government or firms too cannot borrow, right? Borrowing only works when they're savers, when some people delay their consumptions. And borrowing is reallocation. It is not creation of new resources out of nowhere. Okay, it's simply reallocation. If government funds this, big uh, infrastructure projects, right? By issuing government bond, government bond, what happens is that those who buy government bond are giving up their consumption, right? Going back to the doctor, he could have used up all the income. He could have, uh, used up all the income by eating more luxury food, going to many travels, going to travel, buying more expensive things. You know, that can be possible. However, he refrained from doing that, and that's what allowed the government to uh, use the scarce resources in the economy to produce goods and services what that they want to produce, which is education, military infrastructures, or anything else. Or if government use that money to provide subsidy to farmers, then maybe it is indirectly helping farmers. This doctor is indirectly helping farmers, but he's not doing that um, with with the with the intention of helping others. Well, maybe he might has that, but ultimately he's doing that with self-interest because he can get back the money that he lent, in addition to the interest payment that he can receive later. Okay, so it is reallocation, and it is not creation. In this process, there is no new goods. There is no additional resources created in the economy, right? If government issues bond to fund these projects, someone is giving up their consumption, or someone is giving up their investment. If those doctor wasn't necessarily consuming all using up all the income that they earned in the beginning, maybe he used to just put that in bank account, or he used to buy stocks, or he used to buy bonds issued by firms, right? Business bonds. He used to do that, but he shifted that to buying government bonds. In this way, there's less fund available for firms and private firms and things like, yeah, and private businesses. So therefore, some investment is given up in order to realize the government project that they prioritize. So it is reallocation. If government use bond to initiate something, something is given up, right? Uh, Make sure you know that. Okay, and let's get into similarity and differences between borrowing and taxation. They actually have more similarities than a lot of people think, but sometimes still confusing. So let's make sure we understand this fully. Okay, and we all know that both of them are tools used to fund government projects. So tax is also reallocation of resources. Okay, this doctor is you know providing a lot of services to people, to the patients, right? uh, and some of them would be taxed. Therefore, it will be impossible for him to uh, consume as much as what he provided to the economy, right? Because he receives some income, but some of them will be collected by the government. So even though he use up all the disposable income that's left after tax, that would be less than what he actually provided to the economy. And then the government used that to fund the project that they wanted to do. This is reallocation, the same as reallocation happening in the process of borrowing, right? However, there are some differences too. But before that, I have one more important point here. So they're both reallocation scarce resources away from what households or private firms prioritize to what the government prioritize. So make sure you know this reallocation. Okay, if they're not taxed, if doctor's income was not taxed, he would probably go shopping, or he would probably buy some additional snacks, or he would travel maybe. He would buy extra bag, something like that. Whatever that makes him happy as a consumer, as a household. But that decision, or well, that gain wasn't realized because of taxation, and then instead the government can achieve what they want to achieve, maybe funding military, funding education, funding infrastructure, making roads, paying for farmers so agricultural products can increase, uh, something like that. And same as farms, right? For example, when loanable fund is less available for firms because a lot of savers buy uh, federal bonds, government bonds, rather than private bonds, that reallocates resources toward the government, and less loan available for private firms mean they can buy less machines, they can make less factories, uh, they can buy less computers, devices for their operation, whatever. That's gonna happen, but instead government can realize their priorities that I said. And but the key difference is that tax is compulsory. Okay, they can't really refuse it. They have to pay it anyways, uh, and they're not gonna get any promise from it. Well, they could probably receive the provisions of government service like military defense, or policing, or uh, cleaning air, something like that. They can definitely get that service. However, they're not gonna get any cash back. However, when it comes to borrowing, it is voluntary. They have decision. It's up to them. It's up to savers to say no or yes, right? Therefore, the government kind of needs incentive, right? If they don't force them to uh, pay, then they need incentive to make them pay, to make them want to feel like pay. And the way that they do that is by adding interest, right? They make interest payments, so it attracts savers, and savers decide to buy government bonds. So that is the key difference. Okay, compulsory, and they don't need to pay interest for taxes, but they do need to pay interest for uh, uh, when it comes to borrowing. Also, at the same time, they need to pay back the principal too. Don't forget that. And tax, no, you don't need to return anything. And let's get into the reason why deficit or debt may be problematic. So unlike taxing, we have to pay interest. Okay, that's the key difference that I mentioned, right? Larger share of future budget must be devoted to interest payment, leaving less for other needs, right? If you borrow a lot of money, you need to pay back later, not only principal but interest payment, right? And the government needs to do that later, so the government has to give up some service that they could have provided otherwise with that money. And yeah, there's no way to avoid this, because yes, that's how borrowing works. Those people who were producing way more than what they're consuming uh, lended those money to government because they're expecting the return, right? And we can't refuse them. Well, the government has to pay back. So rest of the population kind of have to bear the cost of paying back to those people. And it actually connects to the problem of inequality. Government bonds tend to be held by wealthier people, so interest payment would go to better off individuals, increasing economic inequality. Gini coefficient could probably go up as a result. And also, we need to know the large deficit may crowd out private investment yeah, right, in order to fund public projects. The government redirects its scarce resources in the economy towards something that the government wants, not necessarily what people and private firms want. So it is reallocation, right? Borrowing is not creation; it is reallocation. As a result of this, government can achieve what they want to achieve, but instead someone is giving up, and they're often private firms and also consumers. And what happens as a result of this is that, well, the problem with this is that some people argue that private investment is way more efficient than government investment, or private consumption is way more effective in making consumers happier than government. Okay, firms are very serious about making sure that their investment pays off. So the investment decision is way more smart and could be more effective. But the government may start like making bridges on the places where there are no one who's walking. Right, that can be possible. Same as consumption. Consumers are probably the one who always knows what makes them happy the most, so they can make the decision. However, as a result of government borrowing, the bond interest can be high enough, so it attracts consumers to give up some consumptions and lend money to the government, and government spend that. But government spends on something like military. People might say like, okay, the military defense, self-defense, or the defense spending doesn't make me happy. Some consumers may say that, right? People can disagree. Consumers may not agree with the government in terms of what makes them happy, but government issuing bond to achieve their goals often, um, yeah, uh, results in such situation. And we also need to know that it may often put inflationary pressure. Deficit spending could put inflationary pressure. Um, this happens when the government borrows way more than goods and services that savers are producing. Okay, if 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 budget deficit is moderate enough, so it's around same level or under the level of goods and services that savers are actually producing and not consuming, then it wouldn't probably necessarily put inflationary pressure, right? But if it does, right, quantity demanded could exceed what economy can actually produce, driving up price. So people saving will lose its value. Remember, inflation doesn't again like degrade people's production or anything. Inflation just redistributes wealth, but that can be really painful for people who have been making efforts in saving some money for their plans, something like that. So inflation can have some bad impacts, and it can happen as a result of what is it? Yeah, deficit spending. And let me actually draw this because it's really important to uh, know how this works. Again, deficit spending doesn't always lead to inflation. We have so many examples in the US history of deficit spending not necessarily leading to high inflation, not only in the US but around the world. Uh, it is because if it's at the at modest level, what's going to happen in ASAD model is that AD, and we have price level here, and we also have real GDP here, and this is full employment level of output. So what happens is that a lot of people assume that, oh, government borrows money to uh, purchase stuffs, or government borrows money to pay as subsidies to people, so those people will spend. That will increase AD. A lot of people assume this. That is not wrong at all. That is actually correct. However, that kind of neglects the fact that, again, borrowing is reallocation, not necessarily well, never. Well, it's not a creation of new uh, resources, right? Someone have to be giving up something if government is achieving what they want to achieve. So when government issue bonds to find enough savers, they may raise interest rate, and in that way, some crowding out could happen. So some investment has to be given up. Um, some consumption is given up because consumers decide that it is more rational to save to get that interest from the government rather than spend it now. So there's gonna be some effect of less consumption and less investment, right? So we're gonna have that. So it's gonna go back to here. right? Or it can even go back to the original level, and this happens simultaneously. Therefore, deficit spending would not actually lead to dramatic increase in AD, even if deficit spending itself seems dramatic. So actually, AD wouldn't shift much. So GDP nor inflation price level wouldn't change as much as we think, right? Of course, it could change. It could change, right? Uh, it really depends. There are so many different factors. However, if it's at a moderate level, it doesn't necessarily rapidly increase AD. However, it can actually increase quite rapidly when it's way above uh, what those savers are producing and injecting into the economy, right? And in that case, it's kind of hard to explain, but it's more like, um, how would I say, when that happens, there the amount of budget deficit represents something way more than surplus of goods and services injected by those savers, right? And remember, those rich people have wealth, right? They have accumulated money. However, many of them is something that was made long time ago, not necessarily something that they have just produced, right? They've made production before and they got this money. But however, the annual income may just be this. So as long as the amount of bond that they sell is around this level, like maybe that's not a problem. However, they can actually use those money that they have accumulated before to buy government bond. One person doing that doesn't affect anything. However, what if a lot of rich people do that as a result of government strong requests to uh, buy bond, which often come with probably higher interest rate on the bond, the treasury securities than before. In that ways, those some of those previously accumulated money maybe may turn into uh, treasury bond. However, this doesn't represent the production. Remember, saving or wealth does not represent uh, stockpiles or storage full of goods and services available, right? That's not what it represents. Kind of represent what they have produced before, including maybe something that they produced long time ago or something that they own as a large factories if they have this as a stock or something like that, not necessarily any goods and services that consumers can spend. So therefore, if bond is too much in that way, AD can actually shift, because when this happens, uh, yeah. So, but it's very complicated. But that's the idea. So it doesn't always lead to inflationary pressure, but it could put inflationary pressure. Okay, uh, this one, mounting debt may raise concerns of the government's ability to pay back in the future. So bond prices could fall, or the interest rate can rise. This damaged the future ability for the government to make deficit spending. So what this happened is that, imagine you're an investor, you're a saver, and you look at this chart. The debt of the US as percentage of GDP is rising, rising, rising. Maybe it's constant. You might think like, okay, maybe I don't want to lend my money to those individual who is accumulating, whose debt is surging, right? Maybe it's rational to think in that way. Um and if a lot of people think that, the government is going to struggle to find those who are going to who buy treasury securities, so they have to raise interest rate, and that is painful. The government needs to pay more in interest payment later to to conduct deficit spending, right? That can be really damaging. So it's a sustainability issues. It may not be sustainable if debt is constantly surging, and that might spread concerns among different people. As external debt rises, the U.S. government needs to be making interest payment to foreign companies, governments, individuals, increasing the current account deficit. Right, especially for U.S. Treasury securities, it is held by a lot of foreigners, including foreign government like Japanese government, but also foreign individuals, foreign firms, households, things like that. And in that way, U.S. is making payment toward those foreigners, not U.S. citizens living in the U.S. Maybe some people think it's a bad idea, but also that's like people can disagree. Like foreigners being happy isn't a good thing for the U.S. Or some U.S. people can think that foreigners being happy is also a good thing for U.S. people morally, from a moral standpoint. However, it has some other issues like increasing current account deficit. A lot of more and more foreigners would be lending money to the U.S. U.S. is gonna have more and more land or stocks or bonds, uh, other things uh, held by foreigners, and that might have some issues that I'm not going to talk in details this time because it's really complicated. I'm going to talk about the problem of current account deficit more in detail in another video. So we also have foreign government. The risk of foreign government threatening the U.S. government to selling all these treasury bonds that they hold. Right. For example, China has a bunch of U.S. bond. Japan too. What if Japanese government and Chinese government threaten the U.S., saying, "Okay, we're gonna sell almost or like half of the U.S. bond that we control, we hold right now." That's very scary. And if they sell all of them, the price is gonna fall, and the interest rate is gonna rise. So same as this, the U.S. government will struggle uh, to to fund the deficit, to conduct deficit spending. So it's very scary. So some people can say, deficit debt aren't as problematic as a lot of people think, and there's some truth to it. Reallocation of resources away from private to government agenda isn't inherently bad, right? I explained about this here. Crowding out of private investment or crowding out some private consumption, which could be better than government deciding what is good for people, what is good for firms. Yeah. However, there are actually a lot of cases where maybe government is better at dealing with this, right? For example, borrowing may fund intelligently planned investment, leading to economic growth, increasing tax revenue in the future. Especially, especially the project like infrastructure project that can't really be done by private firms because it's public goods. Remember, it's a microeconomic concept, right? Public goods are often not provided by private firms because private firms find no way to find they find no incentive of doing so. However, collectively, it's going to benefit firms. Good road, good ports, effective airports. Uh, what else? Maybe like good internet provisions, things like that. If those infrastructures are well established, firm is going to effectively produce their goods and services, right? That is amazing, and that can expand the economic activities. That can increase the goods and services that they provide. So tax revenue will rise in the future because of economic growth, and the government can pay that back. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of good things with that, right? Uh, Also, even if borrowing is not necessarily a productive investment, such as infrastructure projects, it may be justifiable from moral or strategic standpoints, such as disaster relief or pandemic relief, or to fight wars and other things. Uh, what it's saying is that, yeah, like not all the deficit spending may be, may not be, not all of them are probably productive investment. For example, disaster relief, forest fire happens or hurricanes hit a town, or what else, tsunami destroyed the town. Tsunami destroyed houses of a lot of people, and that's really sad. So the government decides to borrow money to fund housing projects for those people who lost houses, and that is not necessarily a very productive investment. You could argue otherwise, but not really compared to like making electricity distribution, or like other making a very good, effective internet broadband, or making useful bridges. Compared to that, making houses for those who need it, from the investment standpoint, not necessarily. However, from moral standpoint, it is definitely amazing. The reallocation, so reallocation of resources for those who are in trouble, right? Same as pandemic relief. A lot of people got poor. A lot of people maybe were significantly affected, or a lot of people urgently need enough healthcare or vaccination programs for immunization and things like that. Not all of them are necessarily a strong investment plans that will lead to economic growth. Well, maybe a vaccination plan could. It depends on your perspective. It really depends. But from moral standpoint, it may be smart to do so, and that reallocation is maybe necessary. Yeah, yes, some consumption is given up in that economy, some investment is given up in that economy. However, making sure that those poor people who lost houses because of forest fires or tsunami getting houses is good decision, even if that happens at the cost at the expense of giving up investment and consumption. You could argue that. Uh, Also, strategic, especially from strategic standpoint, fighting wars could be a could have a good justification of issuing bonds, right? During World War Two to defeat the Nazis and fascist Japan. United States of America issued bunch of bond and sold it to general public. A lot of U.S. people bought it, so the government was able to make weapons, missiles, nukes, tanks, and food that is necessary to send it to like soldiers who are fighting in Asia or Europe, things like that, right? That was possible, and yet that was happening at the expense of giving up consumption and investment. Especially private consumption was extremely limited during World War II. People weren't having good living standard. People weren't buying cars or uh, expensive food, luxury food, or they weren't really traveling. They didn't spend on those things. They rather bought government bond. And the part of the reason is that they were kind of prohibited from buying a bunch of those luxury stuff. That is called like rationing, so that's why it was possible. But yeah, right. So consumption was given, and what was the result of this? They were able to defeat the fascists, and they won World War Two. From strategic point of view, maybe reallocation from private investment and private consumption toward public projects such as wars is maybe effective and justifiable, right? It makes sense, right? However, if they're not emergency, then taxation is better than borrowing. Okay, even if it's how do I say? Even if it's a morally justifiable spending or strategically justifiable spending, such as World War Two, if they're not emergency that they constantly need to spend every year, taxation is better because again remember taxation do not have the consequence of paying back the interest, and interest can be really painful because when they fail to pay back the interest just with tax revenue, they have to borrow more, which further increase the interest payment that they need to do in the future. They can delay that by repeating this, but it will keep expanding, right? That is very problematic, and that government has to sacrifice a lot of spending that they could have done otherwise, such as better education or pay to farmers to make more agriculture products. Whatever, they have to be giving up something. So, but taxation don't have those issues. You collect taxes, you don't need to pay back that money. So maybe if those things are only justifiable when it comes to short-term project like disaster relief. We know that pandemic doesn't continue forever. We know that tsunami or earthquake impact is not anything that happens every single year. Wars do. Okay, if economy is in recession, deficit spending can be a way to increase aggregate demand. So as I explained before, like like 10 minutes ago, if it's excessive, if budget deficit, sorry, the deficit spending is uh, excessive, maybe you can shift the AD, right? However, maybe sometimes we want that, right? As I said, AD doesn't necessarily always right when government increased deficit spending because they were often happen as a result of some given up consumption and given up investment. So AD wouldn't necessarily surge as much as we think it would. Uh, However, dramatic increase could actually lead to AD shifting to the right. However, when economy is way below full employment level, meaning that they're in recession, like Great Depression or Great Recession or COVID recession or other recession that U.S. experienced, or stuff, or any countries, people are not going out to buy stuffs because they don't have confidence. Firms are not investing because they don't have confidence. Real GDP. In this way, shifting AD would probably lead to economic growth and cut unemployment rate. So people argue that that's a very effective way. And who did that? Franklin D. Roosevelt did that. Probably the amount of deficit was probably it was I would say definitely way over what savers were uh, producing and injecting into economy, goods and services that they were producing and not consuming. Probably was way above that, so AD was shifting to the right. But higher aggregate demand stimulate more production. That is possible, but that wasn't done, conducted because of because people don't buy it, right? People don't buy, so firms cut down production. Although it is possible to keep the production the same production level over time, they're just simply cutting that back because they can't sell it. However, the government buying them or government stimulating people to buy them would turn the economy, push the economy back into, boom or recovery or expansion. Other point is that old debt can be often replaced by new debt, so we shouldn't like excessively worry. Even if tax revenue is not enough to pay back mature debt, the government can issue and sell new bonds and get enough funding to pay back. So that this is what the government can always do. We always have savers, okay? We always have new savers. Some savers stop saving and start having parties and spend all the savings. Some people do that. However, we are constantly having people who are producing way more than what they're consuming. Constantly. Right? And there are those savers who are joining the saving kind of like, group of people who saves every day. So we don't really need to worry about finding someone who can. So even if government realize that, oh, they have a lot of matured debt or debt that is going to mature tomorrow that they need to pay back, they can simply just get more debt from other people or even from same people, because some people realize that they want to get back those money in 10 years, but in 10 years they realize that they don't really need to spend much, right? That's the reality. And economy is really, a lot of people are very efficient. So many, especially rich people, they're producing way more than what they can ever consume, right? So this replacement can happen quite easily. Always savers one. In other words, we always have a lot of folks who produce. So finding those people who can borrow money wouldn't necessarily be a big issues. However, as I said, interest payment can expand, and if interest payment cannot be fully achieved with tax revenue, they need to get more. They need to borrow even more. However, the interest part would keep expanding, and that can have a lot of bad implications, such as scarce funding for other government project that government they could have done otherwise. Debt held by public in countries like U.S. and Japan are very high, right? In the U.S., it's more than 100% debt held by public. Japan, more than 200%. But yields of bonds are relatively stable, right? Although they have been surging, like both Japan and U.S. It has been surging in the past few decades or 50 years or something like that. But the yields, the interest rate, are not necessarily surging at the same rate or at the scary level. So unlike countries like Greece, which actually has debt per debt, less debt as percentage of GDP, or less debt held by public as percentage of GDP than Japan, right? They are suffering from very very high interest that has surged after a lot of other big issues, right? So what I'm saying is that investors don't only look at debt held by public as percentage of GDP or its change over time and think like, okay, this government is not going to pay back to me, so I'm not going to buy this. That's not how they decide. They're way more. They're way smarter than that. They don't only look at percentage of GDP that as percentage of GDP. They look at so many different factors and decide whether buying it would be a safe options or not. Right? For example, the productive or for example the stability of the economy. Right? What if this economy collapses? What if this country collapses? What if this government collapses? Maybe that can happen for some governments that can be easily invaded by its neighbors, foreign invaders, and that government might be totally destroyed, or the economy may be totally destroyed, right? Imagine like if those investors actually think that Japan can be can collapse as a country suddenly, right? Maybe I don't know, the aliens can come and burn Japanese towns and things like that. If investors imagine and think that that is likely to happen, then they're not going to buy a Japanese bond, because what's going to happen is that after buying it, aliens come and they destroy the cities and destroy all these factories or office and buildings and everything. And inflation will probably spike to 100%, 200%. So even if those investors get back the money later, that won't worth anything, because they're going to receive the interest payment and also principal paying payment with yen. However, yen has devalued so much because as a result of inflation, right? They can't really buy anything